Afternoon and welcome to the Treasury Select Committee inquiry session into the economic impact of the coronavirus. Our first panel is going to be looking at economics of lockdown. My first question, which I'd like to direct at Gigi and David, and perhaps I'll start with Gigi, is you have both carried out cost-benefit analysis of lockdowns, and I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about the approach that you took in each of your models and explain what they seem to tell us, please.
Sure, so I'll start. For the Australian state of Victoria, I prepared a draft partial accounting of the cost of lockdowns that could be compared with the potential benefits of lockdowns in relation to COVID. And essentially, I simply approached it as saying, if we have 1 month worth of lockdowns, what costs would we expect there to be from those lockdowns? And I used what I thought were reasonable assumptions, but actually quite biased in favor of finding that lockdowns passed the cost-benefit test. In other words, that they were saving lives on net. My analysis resulted in the conclusion that actually 6 weeks of lockdown, which is as long as the second lockdown wave has been in Victoria, is more costly, in fact, 3 times more costly in terms of lives than it is actually saving. So that was the basic conclusion, and I've written it up in 4 pages for the Victorian government.
Okay. And Gigi, what are the sort of moving parts of your analysis? How do you go about coming to that conclusion? How does that work?
Well, you first need to nominate all the various costs that are likely to eventuate from lockdowns. And so for that, you need to understand what's happening to people during lockdowns. And one of the big things is a decline in mental health, which has been found actually in the UK, has pretty good data on this. And so I'm trying to capture that decline in standard currency that can be compared to basically the number of lives or some currency that's potentially saved from the lockdown. That's the main task. And so then that's one lockdown cost. Other lockdown costs include, of course, the reduction in GDP and then the longer run impact of that in terms of reducing government expenditure and private expenditure, both of which serve to promote human well-being, both now and in the future. And of course, some of that cost of the decline in GDP is due to lockdowns per se. Some of it is potentially due to responses of individuals who are fearful. And then there are other costs as well: crowded out healthcare, increased suicides, foregone wages of children whose schooling has been disrupted, etc. Some people are extremely reluctant to engage in this kind of an accounting. And sometimes it's really just because people don't want to face the fact that if we are in a world of scarce resources, then we must make trade-offs. There is no way to avoid that. And these trade-offs are inevitably in terms of money spent on things that will promote life. And so, we have to think about putting a price on a life year, unfortunately, and we do it anyway in normal times. But this pandemic has brought to the surface the fact that it's useful to do that. And I think that makes some people very uncomfortable.
I'm going to focus my questions on the estimated number of lives saved. And starting with Professor Miles and Professor Foster. Professor Foster, you mentioned the 1.5 million COVID deaths that was being estimated. The UK government's own analysis indicates that mitigation, including social restrictions, has prevented that 1.5 million number of deaths.
Well, I certainly do think that it's that 1.5 million deaths is totally unrealistic based on the observed death rates in any country in the world that we've seen so far. And therefore, it's very clear that the UK is killing many more people via lockdowns and suspended health services than it could possibly save from COVID.
Now, what are the key lessons that need to be learned from what's gone on before in terms of what we do going forward? Who would like to come in first? Professor Miles.
If I may briefly. I think the crucial thing is to really come back to this formidably difficult question about trade-offs. It's very clear that you could bring the infection rate down in the UK and you could have an impact on the number of deaths that we face between now and Christmas with a return to a very strict lockdown and keep it in place for 3 months. It's also very clear that the economic and health damage of that would be absolutely enormous. But I think you can't get around this question, whichever way you try, of trying to evaluate, assess in some way the trade-offs. It may be that a short, sharp lockdown for a week or two, will not cause enormous negative knock-on effects, but maybe it won't save all that many lives either, because once you relax it, you'll just be back on the track that you would. And I think it's that trade-off that you simply can't avoid trying to assess. And if I may say very briefly, one of the things I find slightly puzzling, it's not a criticism, but slightly puzzling about some of the very clear policy recommendations that come out of SAGE, is that on the one hand, although they seem to recognize this trade-off, they also give advice which actually ignores the trade-off. I was very struck by reading the SAGE advice of 21st of September, which was released very recently, which said that essentially we need another lockdown in the UK. And if I may just read, it won't take more than 20 seconds, just read what they went on to say. The evidence based into the effectiveness and harm of these interventions is generally weak. Nevertheless, non-pharmaceutical interventions will need to be in place for a considerable period of time. It is important, therefore, that studies are undertaken to evaluate the risks in different settings and the impact of different policies. Suggested data analysis of studies include studies on the impact of harm of interventions. What I think is extraordinary in some ways about that is that it is advice that we should definitely follow a policy, but also admitting that we don't know what the side effects will be, and wouldn't it be a good idea if somebody else thought about them? In some ways, it's rather a strange position for medically minded people to reach. We think there's a very harmful side effects. We don't know what they are, but I'm pretty sure you should do this.
Given your analysis, the data analysis, which seems very, very similar to Gigi's data analysis, what do you think the policy implication is of that? If you were recommending to government what they should do now?
Policy recommendation is that a lockdown as harsh, strict as we had back in the back end of March, running through April and much of May, is extraordinarily costly. And one would have to be, I think, convinced that the scale of lives saved would be enormous and probably much larger than is plausible for that to be a sensible policy. I think, therefore, government should be wary of going down the road of thinking that we have to keep imposing very harsh lockdowns, try it for a few weeks, then maybe try it again in a few weeks and try it again in a few weeks of that. Particularly if the advice they're receiving is perhaps not paying enough attention on the cost side of what that does. And I don't simply mean GDP. I think some people have, not the sophisticated audience today, but some people have a view that, oh, well, it's money on the one hand and lives, and you can't do that calculation. Lives are without price. They're so valuable, so we can't worry about GDP. What strikes me as being overwhelmingly likely is that the mental health and welfare and other health issues that go with economic disruption are so large that this is badly characterized as, oh, it's money and GDP on the one hand and something far more valuable, lives on the other. That's not right. It's welfare and quality of life against welfare and quality of life. And that's why I think government, and I'm sure it is, needs to think enormously carefully about the cost of at least lengthy lockdowns.
Thank you so much for, I would like to say, the most fascinating session that I've sat through in my tenure on the Treasury Select Committee.